Welcome here this afternoon. It's great to see such a great turnout for the annual Leadership Research Colloquium series that we have. My name is Nathan Hiller. I'm the Academic Director at the Center for Leadership. I know that a number of you are familiar with some of the things that the Center does, but just to give you kind of a brief overview of some of the work that the Center does, we're primarily engaged in three things. One is programs, and some of those programs are open enrollment for leadership development, and some of them are programs where we work with organizations such as principals at the Miami-Dade County Public Schools, as well as with the Miami Foundation. We work with the young fellows. So we offer leadership development programs for people in the community. The second wing of what we do is leadership lectures and things for specifically that benefit the community that are entirely free. And this then, of course, being one of those. We have a series of talks throughout the year and also do some work internally within the university. And the third main aim of the center is research. And what you will be hearing today, in essence, is the mix of the speaker series, the free series that we do, as well as the research. What we believe in is trying to make sure that we are getting the information about the social science of leadership out there and done so in a practical way. The thing that never ceases to amaze me is that there actually is a social science of leadership. We don't have all of the answers. And like many social science, there's often not a specific great formula that can explain everything. But through the science, through the social science of understanding a variety of the features related to leadership and what makes leaders more effective, things about the relationship, things about how people perceive leaders, we're able to understand some insights that we wouldn't otherwise be able to get to just from common sense. So one of the things I always tell my students is some of what you might learn is common sense, and some of it is very much against common sense, because common sense isn't often so common, it turns out. I would like to acknowledge a few people who are here with us today. I see that we have the President Emeritus of FIU and the founder of the Center for Leadership, Mitch Medic. And the provost may be joining us as well here in a few minutes. So, we also have a number of people from Baptist here today and from Jackson, and I know there are a number of other people from other organizations outside of the university. So, welcome. The theme of this year's colloquium is the title is "My Boss Thinks Things Are Great." ... It was intended to, so you're going to hear three different research presentations that are on fairly different topics, but they all get the essence of one of the things that we found that is very important in the context of leadership. And it is this: it's the way that you experience your work environment to a large extent has to do with your immediate boss. Company can have great policies. You might have great colleagues, but there's the extent to which you have an effective working relationship with your boss and the environment that they create turns out to be very important. There's a saying that's often said, people don't leave bad organizations, they leave bad bosses. And there's some truth to that, of course. It doesn't always explain everything. But that's the theme that we're going to be approaching from a number of different angles. And the first speaker that we have today is Dr. Emily Grijalva. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Management at SUNY Buffalo. She just finished her dissertation, her PhD. She is a newly minted PhD, and she is the recipient of the Alva Chapman Dissertation Award, which we'll be giving a brief presentation to her later, sponsored by the FIU Center for Leadership and the Academy of Management Network of Leadership Scholars. So every year we have an international search for the best dissertation in the topic of leadership. And you're going to be hearing from the winner of this past year's award. So we're thrilled to have her here. So her work is at the intersection of narcissism and leadership. Now, narcissism is something that people have been talking about a lot in all kinds of venues lately, particularly in the context of major corporate failures, but also thinking about are people more narcissistic these days than they were in the past. And a lot of Emily's work focuses on issues related to this. Particularly today, she's going to be talking about narcissism in the context of leadership. And is narcissism a good thing in the context of leadership? And it turns out that the answer is there's a qualification. And so it's not a simple yes or no answer. Her work has been recently, we're working on a project together, and she emailed me one week and said, can we wait a week? I'm being inundated by media outlets asking for interviews because some of the work that she's done has been gaining a lot of attention. She's been featured in the Washington Post, in The Guardian in the UK, on the front cover of Times webpage, and most importantly, and we joke about this, on the front page of MTV News website. Ironically, though, she said of all of the treatments of her research that people were talking about, actually, ironically, MTV News did probably the best job of it, which goes to show you that you don't always know what you can expect. So I'll hand the mic over to her in just 1 second. There's two things that I want to just say briefly. Her project is a meta-analysis. And for some of you who may not be familiar with that term, and I would expect many of you would not know that term, what it is it's a synthesis, it's a quantitative synthesis of the entire research body that has been done on a particular topic. So in other words, she took every study that's ever been done on the topic of narcissism and leadership to say, overall, what can we find? So in some ways, it's quite a definitive study. The other thing that's interesting that you'll pick up quickly is there's a distinction between leadership emergence and leadership effectiveness. So people who emerge in ambiguous situations, or people who quickly emerge as a leader, where people say, ooh, that person looks like they're the leader, that is different from being effective as a leader in the long term, right? And so what predicts who will show up or be called a leader first is sometimes quite different from what the characteristics are of someone who is going to be effective at leadership. And so without further ado, I introduce Emily Grijalva. Thank you, Dr. Grijalva.
Thank you for that nice introduction. It's an honor to be here today and have this opportunity to share my research with you, as well as being a huge honor to be the 2014 recipient of the Alva H. Chapman Dissertation Award. In my talk today, I'm going to be discussing narcissistic leaders. One of my favorite narcissistic leaders is Steve Jobs. And of course, I didn't personally know Steve Jobs. A lot of my examples of his behavior come from Walter Isaacson's recent biography about Jobs' life. From my perspective, Steve Jobs is a great example of a narcissistic leader because he embodied both the positive and the negative components of narcissism. The characteristics that made him successful sometimes also got him into trouble. For example, part of his success as the CEO and founder of Apple has been partly attributed to his enormous charisma, which enabled him to inspire tremendous loyalty in his followers, but also to overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. At the same time, of course, we all know Steve Jobs was no saint, right? He was criticized for his arrogance and abrasive interpersonal style, especially as a manager. In Isaacson's biography, which Jobs himself sanctioned, He was described as being harsh and sometimes even cruel to his employees. He was known for being an exacting perfectionist, and he frequently insulted and sometimes publicly humiliated his employees when they didn't live up to his high expectations. So this is what makes narcissistic leaders like Steve Jobs so fascinating. It's the complexity. They're difficult to categorize as good or bad leaders because they have positive characteristics like charisma and self-confidence that are accompanied by negative characteristics such as arrogance, entitlement, exploitativeness, both of which could arguably be related to leadership outcomes. Despite these contradictions, in my talk today, I'm going to be attempting to answer the question, if you are a narcissist, are you likely to be a good leader? First, though, I want to make sure we're on the same page regarding what narcissism is. It has 3 defining characteristics. The first is narcissists tend to have an exaggerated sense of their own self-importance. This can even be a delusional proportions. They're preoccupied with thoughts and fantasies of enormous success, power, attractiveness. The second defining characteristic is that narcissists expect to be recognized as superior and special, even without superior accomplishments. They expect constant admiration and attention. One of the most interesting ways I've encountered to view narcissism is as an addiction to others' admiration. Finally, narcissists think they're better than other people, and they lack empathy for others. It's easy to see how destructive this would be for personal relationships and in the workplace, especially if you give a narcissist a position of authority. One last thing I want to point out is that today I'm talking about narcissism as a personality trait, not as a clinical disorder. I'm talking about subclinical narcissism or a milder form of narcissism. Given how negatively I just described it, you might be surprised to learn that narcissism has a relatively controversial relationship with leadership outcomes. Some scholars have found that it has a negative relationship, and some have found a positive relationship with leadership outcomes. These are a few representative examples of that research. To explain the negative relationship is relatively intuitive. People just point to the host of negative traits associated with narcissism, many of which I just mentioned, such as being exploitative, entitled, lacking empathy for others. To explain the positive relationship that sometimes emerges, researchers say, narcissism is a complex trait. So you have to remember, it's also associated with self-confidence and charisma as well. Michael Maccabee, in a 2000 Harvard Business Review paper, said you cannot be a good leader without some degree of narcissism, because you need to be self-confident and believe that you're special in order to gain followers' trust. So in short, there exist reasonable explanations for narcissism having both a positive and a negative relationship with leadership outcomes. So this is the state of the field when I was choosing my dissertation topic. Fortunately, we have a way of dealing with these kinds of inconsistencies in the literature. And like what Nathan was saying, I performed a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is a fancy term for aggregating all the existing data. So it's a statistical method where you combine the results from different studies. And it seemed like the ideal way to handle these inconsistencies because it would allow me to estimate the overall relationship between narcissism and leadership, but also to search for sources of the inconsistencies that we were observing. When I first started the meta-analysis, it occurred to me that narcissism likely has different relationships with the different phases of leadership emergence as opposed to effectiveness. And this is because narcissists tend to make a great first impression. If you've ever met a narcissist at a party, you probably immediately thought they seemed really fun and exciting and you wanted to spend more time with that person. But as you get to know them better, narcissists' relationships with others tend to deteriorate. Right? And so Paul Hess, 1998, conducted this interesting study. He had small groups of undergraduates meet for 20 minutes over 7 consecutive weeks, and they were working on a group project together. After the first meeting, the group members rated one another, and narcissists were actually described quite positively as confident, entertaining, and physically attractive. But by the end of the study, the group members had known each other for about 2 months. This changed. Narcissists were described quite negatively, using adjectives such as hostile, arrogant, and cold. Group members also said narcissists hadn't contributed to group goals, and they appeared to be psychologically unhealthy. Right, just a little bit. So, given how individuals' perceptions of narcissists change over time, I decided to differentiate between leader emergence, and this is the tendency to be perceived as a leader, as leader-like. Differentiate that from leadership effectiveness, or how well someone actually performs in a leadership role. This is a distinction that is quite common in the literature. First, I'll describe narcissism's relationship with leadership emergence, using the framework provided by implicit leadership theory. This theory suggests that we choose our leaders based on how closely their characteristics match those of a prototypical leader. And it turns out that, in fact, a lot of narcissist characteristics are also described as being very leader-like. They're associated with being extroverted and socially dominant. And other studies have shown people with those characteristics do tend to emerge as leaders. Schmulke and Eagleoff 2010 even identified more specific perceptual cues narcissists give off that affect their leadership emergence. These are important. These are that narcissists tend to be well-dressed. They tend to have confident facial expressions and body language, and they tend to use verbal humor. All of that makes them appear to be charming when you first meet them. Narcissism's relationship with leadership effectiveness, however, is expected to be more complicated because over time, those positive elements of narcissism that I've been talking about, the self-confidence and charisma, they're joined by more negative elements. And in fact, narcissism is associated with a host of interpersonally toxic traits, such as exploitativeness, a lack of empathy for other people, and just having very little interest in initiating or maintaining intimate relationship with others. These deficits, these interpersonal deficits of narcissists are important because they could affect the quality of leader-member exchange relationships. No one wants to work for an inconsiderate, selfish leader. And the quality of these leader-member exchange relationships, how well you get along with your boss, if you like your boss, that's actually been shown to predict followers' or employees' job performance. So in short, I'm suggesting narcissism will have a negative relationship with leadership effectiveness through the relational consideration component of leadership effectiveness. Now, I'm going to describe to you the procedure I used for the meta-analysis relatively briefly. To be included, these past studies had to have a correlation between narcissism and leader emergence or narcissism and leader effectiveness. For leader emergence, I coded these studies if they were based on who was the preferred leader after a leaderless group discussion exercise or leadership potential ratings from a supervisor. Whereas on the other hand, leadership effectiveness was primarily based on ratings of overall leadership performance. I excluded clinical samples and clinical measures of narcissism, but it turned out this was not a problem because clinical researchers are not really measuring leadership. So that didn't exclude any studies. Instead, I included these 3 measures of narcissism that capture the subclinical personality trait. The most common was the Narcissistic Personality Inventory. Then one final note is that for leadership effectiveness, I only included working adult samples, so people who were actually employed at the time, to get a sense of whether they were a good leader. I used Hunter and Schmidt 2004 procedure to calculate the correlation coefficients. And now this is what we've all been waiting for, some data. So these are my results. Recall, I hypothesized narcissism would have a positive relationship with leadership emergence. And this hypothesis was supported. The corrected correlation here is 0.16. This was based on 18 different studies. That's what K means. and 3,000 participants. So it turns out, yes, we do perceive narcissists as being slightly more leader-like. And this has several important implications. When you first meet someone in a job interview and you think, oh, I really want to hire this person, they seem like they could take on a leadership role, you might want to think a little bit more about it, get to know them better, because it's possible that you could be having that perception of them because they're narcissistic. But also, from the other viewpoint, if you have a job interview and you want to be perceived as leader-like, perhaps you could act a little bit more narcissistic. You could be well-dressed, use verbal humor, have a confident facial expression and body language. Narcissists also are not shy about talking about themselves in a job interview. And it turns out all of that does help you be perceived as slightly more leader-like. So up to this point, we've seen narcissists are more likely to attain leadership roles. But the question remains, after they've been chosen as a leader, are they good at it? And recall, my theoretical rationale here was that the relationship would be negative because of narcissists and our personal deficits. But the corrected correlation here was near zero. It was 0.03. 0.03. That was so low. When I found that, I thought, oh gosh, I'm never going to be able to publish this study. I won't get a job. You know, all these thoughts were running through my mind. And I took a step back, and I thought, well, but, okay, maybe there are important boundary conditions that I'm missing. And if I look at those, then I'll find why past researchers were getting mixed results. One of the most obvious boundary conditions I examined was the source of leadership report. And I looked at 4 different sources here: self-report, supervisor report, subordinate report, and peer report. So maybe different people in the organization have different interactions with a narcissist. Prior research has shown that narcissists tend to self-enhance across a variety of criteria. Probably not surprising, right? They think that they're more attractive, intelligent, creative than other people do. I hypothesized that narcissism's relationship with leadership effectiveness would be stronger when it was self-reported. And it turns out that, yes, this is the case. If you ask a narcissist, then they will tell you that they are an effective leader. But, right, but if you look at the other sources, supervisor, subordinate, and peer, they're much closer to zero. And they don't differ from one another. One takeaway here, a practical implication, is if you are interested in measuring whether narcissists are good leaders, you probably should not be asking them to self-report their leadership effectiveness, right? Overall, I found that narcissists do tend to emerge as leaders, but they're no more or less likely to be effective leaders unless you ask them to self-report leadership effectiveness, but, you know, that's an untrustworthy estimate there. But I was still having trouble accepting that there was no relationship between narcissism and leadership effectiveness. One potential explanation is that I was using traditional statistical methods that are designed to detect linear relationships. Perhaps the relationship between narcissism and effectiveness is actually curvilinear. And this is what I examined in study 2. Specifically, I hypothesized it would take the shape of an inverted U. If this is the case, then moderate levels of narcissism would actually be ideal. So moderate levels of something that's traditionally been considered to be a negative characteristic, whereas very low levels could lead to insecure, hesitant leaders, and very high levels could lead to arrogant, tyrannical leaders. It might seem strange that a lack of narcissism would actually be detrimental to leadership, but you have to keep in mind that narcissism is complex. It has both positive and negative components. And so maybe you do need a little bit of entitlement and self-confidence in order to be a good leader. To examine this hypothesis, I was lucky enough to work with Hogan Assessment Systems. They allowed me access to 6 different samples. These were all collected in the United States. They ranged in sample size from 103 to 798 individuals for a total sample size of 1,710 participants. And they came from a variety of different industries as well. So you can see construction, postal service, banking, all kinds of industries. Each of these samples, the narcissism measure was the Hogan Development Survey Bold Scale, and leadership effectiveness was based on supervisor reports, although the items for each of the measures of leadership effectiveness were different. Then, in order to calculate the curvilinear relationship, I did something that's a little bit unique. I used the same method as past researchers to actually meta-analyze curvilinear effects, which is pretty cool and unusual in the literature to be able to do this. To make something a little bit more complex simpler, I took the square root of the change in our square, which is this. That statistic there is an indication of how big the curvilinear relationship between narcissism and leadership effectiveness is, independent of the linear relationship. So it's a pure measure of the curvilinear relationship. And then I took the square root of that, which produces a correlation coefficient that I then meta-analyzed using the same methods I previously described. The question here was whether moderate levels of narcissism are ideal. And it turns out, when I combined all the information from the 6 samples, the answer to this question is yes. Narcissism is neither wholly beneficial nor harmful, but it's best in moderation. And this is the best existing estimate we have right now of narcissism's relationship with leadership effectiveness. It's based on 6 different samples and almost 2,000 participants. A lot of times when researchers look at these curvilinear relationships, they use 1, maybe 2 samples. But in this case, I use many more. So in terms of a practical implication for organizations, it would be that if you're using narcissism measures to select your employees, you should select individuals with moderate levels of narcissism, not really low levels. I also wanted to show you a visual depiction of the quadratic regression line for each of the 6 samples. The quadratic regression coefficient was negative for all 6 samples, which is consistent with an inverted U-shaped relationship, and you can see that it's emerging nicely across most of the samples. However, the quadratic coefficient was relatively small. And although this is common in the organizational sciences, these quadratic effects usually explain maybe 1% of the variance. When you have these small effects, however, you need really large sample sizes in order to detect the true effect. Individually, the curvilinear effect was significant in 2 samples. But when I combined all of the data together and I had more statistical power, I was able to detect this quadratic relationship. Overall, my study has 2 main implications. It showed us that when we're looking at narcissism and leadership, we should differentiate between narcissism's relationship with leadership emergence and effectiveness. I showed that narcissists tend to emerge as leaders, but there's no linear relationship between narcissism and leader effectiveness. At the same time, before my paper was published, the current or prior theoretical discussion had implicitly assumed that the relationship was linear. After this paper, I'm hoping people will stop asking the question, are narcissists good or bad leaders? Are they ideal leaders? Instead ask, how much narcissism is ideal for leadership? Because I showed that narcissism is neither wholly beneficial nor harmful, but it's best in moderation. So I want to thank you all for your patience today, listening to my study. Like I said, it's now been published in Personnel Psychology. It actually came out last month, so this is a little bit outdated, but if you're interested in the project, please feel free to email me, and you can look up the paper there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. And if any of you are wondering about, is there really a sciencey part of this, when she uses terms like the quadratic equation and shows some of those graphs, it certainly confirms that. Thank you very much. I want to introduce our next speaker, who is a faculty member in the College of Business at FIU, Dr. Hakpeng Sin, who has been at FIU, we stole him away from Michigan State, where he was an assistant professor there, and he did his PhD at Penn State. Prior to that, he had done some work at the National University of Singapore, and his research interests include leadership and management of dynamic performance, so how your performance changes over time, right? So you may be really good at one point, but does it keep going up, or does it actually go down? So he's interested in those trajectories and how they are different. His work has been published in many of the top journals in our field, and he is the recipient of a Best Paper of the Year award from one of the primary leadership outlets called Leadership Quarterly. And he'll be talking today about the effects of leader-follower incongruence and risk propensity on followers' creativity. What did I just say? Yeah, exactly. He'll explain. So creativity is the outcome of interest, right? We're not looking at overall performance. He had a measure of research and development. If you look at research and development departments, one of the things that is beneficial is creative performance. And he's looking at creative performance and saying, is it good if you have a tendency towards high levels of risk? If you're comfortable with a high level of risk, does that make you more or less creative? And then looking at how that interacts with what's your boss's risk propensity? And the answer, which he will talk about, is that some counterbalancing may be helpful. Dr. Hakpeng Sin.
So the title of my topic is on effects of leader-member incongruence effect or complementarity on followers' creative performance. First of all, let me set the stage. Whether creative performance is considered to be important in the business world. All right. How many of you have heard of Borders? Okay. Where is Borders now? No longer around. Okay. Borders was cutting edge at one time. Okay. And it is a company that is creative in the forefront of the book selling business in the 80s and 90s, doing really well. And all of a sudden, what happened? And it vanished. It declared bankruptcy in 2011 and basically ceased to exist. Compare that or contrast that to Barnes & Noble, which we actually have one around the corner. Okay. What's the difference between Borders and Barnes & Noble? What's the distinctiveness that allows Barnes & Noble to still be in business? One of the reason is they continue to be creative. Okay, they are contrasting or comparing Borders and Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble had the e-reader. They had the Nook. They try to stay in that space, and they are able to still survive. Okay, I wouldn't say thrive. Okay, but they are still struggling a bit. But at least they are surviving compared to Borders. Okay. At the end, if you look at Amazon.com, which is really, quote unquote, the new kid on the block, with the invention of internet, they really leverage the whole space and allow them to be innovative in the book selling business. And they literally crush the competitions in terms of comparing the Borders and Barnes & Noble. The same thing is true in the movies and video rental industry. Okay, when I first, originally I came from Singapore. When I first came to the US, I was fascinated by all the big box stores. Okay, it's like big box stores, lots of merchandise, big aisles. Blockbuster, one of the go-to places when I rent movies when I first came. Same thing. Okay, that business model was creative and innovative in the 80s and 90s, but they did not keep up with time. They did not continue to be creative and innovate. And lo and behold, here comes Netflix. Okay, that really. How many of you have Netflix account? There you go. So Netflix took over the whole movie and video rental business, and they continue to innovate in terms of. In the beginning, it was mailing of DVDs, but they move on to streaming, and now they move on to content. Okay, they're developing their own original content and so forth. So you can tell that it is a company that is not just innovative in the beginning, but continue to be creative and innovative. But is that the fate of all companies? You flourish for 10, 20 years, and then you fade away. Not really. The next one I have up there, G. Okay, what's the tagline? Imagination at work. Okay, G was founded way back in 1892. Okay, by Thomas Edison and other co-founders. And along the way, okay, it started as light bulbs. Okay, but along the way, they continue to come up with new ideas, new innovations that allow them to not just expand but thrive. Okay, it's been consistently rated as one of the best company, including most innovative company. So, in other words, innovative ideas and creativity in business is important. Okay? It's important not just in the beginning, but it is important as a sustained process over years. So, what is creativity? Okay? So, the examples I gave you earlier is big examples of big ideas, but creativity really boils down to the day-to-day activities, day-to-day ideas that employees generate and try to carry out along the way. So I have some quotes here. Okay, the first one: there's no doubt that creativity is the most important human resource of all. Without creativity, there would be no progress, and we would be forever repeating the same patterns. Okay. Some even say without creativity, we'll still be eating raw meat, no fire. Okay, we'll still be hunting and gathering. Okay, no farming. Okay, no farming or agriculture. Okay. The second quote I have up here: the essential part of creativity is not being afraid to fail. Okay, which is one of the big driver I want to talk about today. It's the idea about the importance of risk-taking as a precursor or predictor of creative performance. The third quote I have up here: creativity or creative activity could be described as a type of learning process where teacher and pupil are located in the same individual. Okay, so this quote talks about the same person should be both exploring and both trying to explore and try to be introspective. Okay. But I would venture to say that beyond just the same individual, in today's world, creative enterprise is not just one person's work, but it's a teamwork, either as a team or, in my context for this study, is the effort between the leaders and the followers. Okay. So first, let me talk about the importance of risk-taking in creative performance. So the concept that we have or studied is called risk propensity. Okay. Essentially, it is an individual's inclination or tendency to take or avoid risks. Okay. And it is a strong antecedent for risk-taking behaviors. So someone who is high on risk propensity are more likely to take risks. They're the one who say, all right, this seems out of the ordinary, but let's go for it, let's try it. Okay. Someone who is low is more skittish. Not surprised, okay, there has been theory as well as research that shows that bold decisions and actions are often necessary to achieve innovative results. Okay, it is those who dare to push the boundaries, people who dare to do those, to push the boundaries, those are the ones who can create new things. Okay, so risk propensity has been theorized to be positively related to creativity. Subsequently, empirical research also panned out that way, okay, in the sense that individual difference in risk propensity does indeed predict creative performance. And I have several slides up there. So, is that the end of the discussion? Are we saying that, all right, high risk propensity is positively related, and therefore we always want people who are extremely or high, the higher the better. Is that always the case? No. So the first talk just mentioned to you about the curvilinear relationship. Surprise, surprise, okay? In our world of understanding risk propensity and predicting creative performance, it is important also to look at I call it the dark side of risk propensity, okay? And therefore, the importance to balance that out. Okay, what is the dark side of risk propensity? It turns out risk propensity is also highly correlated with impulsivity, okay? So someone who is high in risk propensity is not only high in risk-taking and saying, all right, let's be gung-ho, let's try this out, let's push the boundaries, but someone who is high in risk propensity also turn out to be high, or in general, high in impulsivity, which is the tendency to enter into situations or rapidly respond to cues for potential reward without much planning or deliberation. Okay, those are the keywords. Okay, without much planning or deliberation. So those are the ones who are gung-ho, sure, but at the same time, they may be overstepping, overreaching. Okay. So that's the dark side of risk propensity. And in our paper, or in my paper, I'm trying to ascertain or to find that, okay, if we want to have production of creativity, does it require both risk-seeking and risk control? Okay? Do we really require the balance in order to have the maximum level of creative performance? And the risk-seeking and risk control really is the indicators of seeking novelty as well as sticking to things that are useful, practical, and potentially helpful. So earlier in the quote, I talked about having the teacher and the learner in the same person, but here, not so much the same person, but the same diets. Okay, the leader and the follower as a pair. Perhaps, okay, it might be too much to ask a person to have both risk-seeking and risk control. Okay, but what if we have leader and member who can engender the risk-seeking part and the risk control part? Would that allow us to counterbalance or balance out the dark side of risk propensity? And therefore, we have this notion of calculated risks. The third thought I have is, in addition to just the incongruous effect, so I call that the complementary fit, which is a technical term we use in our research, really is the notion that are different levels. So the leader and the member have different levels of risk propensity. Okay. But is it always just different levels? The next part is, I looked at the asymmetric effects of that complementary fit. Okay. In the sense that, if you think about it, which one has more impact in the leader-follower interaction? Does the leader have more impact in the interaction, or does the member have more impact? The leader, all right? So the leader tends to have more impact in a leader-follower interactions. So in this case, followers, essentially, they take cues from the leaders. And when they have leaders who are high in risk propensity, essentially they know that, hey, the environment is tolerant of risk-taking, and it is worthwhile to engage in creative tasks. Okay. In contrast, when you have leaders who are low on risk propensity, and the leader is therefore sending out signals to the followers that, hey, the environment is more favorable to habitual actions and standards. Let's stick to what we know. Let's stick to the protocol. Okay? So the leaders tend, on average, to have greater impact on the followers than the other way around in a leader-follower interactions. So, three main ideas, okay? Whether risk propensity is good, and is there a curvilinear relationship. Second idea, is there a counterbalancing that's required or needed that will enhance creative performance. And third, whether the impact of leader is higher than the impact of follower. So for this study, okay, as Nathan mentioned earlier, we collected data from R&D department in a large telecom company in southeastern China. Okay, so the beauty of it is that it is our research and development department. So part of their core job description and their core job function is to be creative. Okay, so the followers are doing those tasks, and the leaders are in a good position to be rating the followers on their creative performance. All right, we have about over 200 followers and 32 leaders, okay, in our sample. And in this case, we assess or we measure creative performance as rated by the leaders. So the leaders rated the followers on their creative performance. And for risk propensity, the data were collected from both sources. So the leaders rated their own risk propensity. The followers also rated their own risk propensity. Okay. The technical term we have in our field is by doing so, by having cross-source information, cross-source data, we are reducing a lot of what we call common method bias. Okay. In other words, it's good to have data from different sources. In addition to that, we also have control variables. Okay. Control variables, things like gender difference, age difference, education difference, and the dyadic tenure. Okay. Those are controlled for to make sure they are not the alternative explanations for our finding. Okay. I will not go into all the numbers and equations. Okay. Essentially, for this type of data, which is needed to conduct it or analyze it using polynomial regression. Okay. Polynomial regression is nice at the end of polynomial regressions. It allows us to look at a three-dimensional figure that helps you visualize the results. Okay, so the results, part one. Okay, first, is risk propensity helpful in predicting creative performance? As it turns out, when leaders and followers are aligned, okay, meaning they are similar, okay, all else equal, on average, higher level of risk propensity leads to higher level of follower creative performance. The results looks like this. Okay, so this is a three-dimensional figure that represents the best fitting instead of best fitting line in a typical regression equation. This is a best fitting plane. Okay, in a three-dimensional representation of the data. Okay, so let me briefly walk you through. So I think the pointer is working. Perfect. So this axis is the follower level of risk propensity. Okay, 0 is average, here is low, and here is high. Okay, the other axis, okay, I wish I could put a number here, but because of the figure, I put the numbers there. But really, it's low leader risk propensity, average leader risk propensity, and high leader risk propensity. All right. The nice thing about the 3D representation of the data is we can capture all the results in one figure. Okay, of course we have ran the statistical analysis and so forth, but this is the results. So if you look at an imaginary line from here to here, this is the line of congruence. Line of congruence in the sense that the leader and the member or the follower has the same level of risk propensity. So here will be -2, -2. Okay, the follower has -2 in terms of risk propensity. The leader has -2 in terms of risk propensity. Follow along this plane or this line of congruence. Somewhere here will be average risk propensity for both, and here will be high risk propensity for the follower, as well as high risk propensity for the leader. Okay, so if you look at this line of congruence, this is the results. Okay, so this is the result for the part one. So on average, as risk propensity increases, okay, creative performance by the followers also increases. But there is a slight dip at the high end, okay, the curvilinear relationship. Okay, but again, all else equal, on average, high risk propensity does indeed lead to higher level of creative performance. Second part of our results, okay, leader-follower incongruence or the differences in levels of risk propensity is positively related to followers' creative performance. Okay, it's the same figure, okay, that I reproduce here again. Here, to see the dissimilarity effect, okay, meaning when leaders and members have different levels of risk propensity, okay, you look at the line of incongruence. So it's from here to here. Okay, so this is when the follower risk propensity is very high, okay, but the leader risk propensity is very low. Okay, and here is when the follower risk propensity is very low, but the leader risk propensity is very high. So if you look at the information along this line, what do you see? You see a U shape that happened this way. Okay, so essentially you see, imagine a paper that folded up. Okay, so in other words, as there is dissimilarity between leader and the follower in their degree of risk propensity, the level of follower creative performance actually went up. Okay, which speaks to the earlier point about the counterbalancing of risk-taking and risk control actually resulted or leads to better performance or better creative performance. All right. Next, the third part of the finding is creative performance is higher when a leader's risk propensity is higher than a follower's rather than when a follower's is higher than the leader's. In other words, the leader's impact is higher. Okay. How do we look at that? Okay. Same thing, looking at this curvature. This effect is slightly weaker but still significant in the sense that if you look at this, this side of the curve is actually higher or stronger than this side of the curve. Okay? Which essentially means that on average, okay, when a leader is higher than the follower in risk propensity, okay, the follower creativity is higher than the other way around. Okay? So, three results all contained in the same picture, which I liked. Okay? So, what do all this mean? Okay? In terms of managerial implications, at the end of the day, the first thing is still true. Okay? All else equal, risk propensity appear to be related favorably with creative performance. Okay? On average, having high level of risk propensity leads to risk-taking, and it is those risk-taking behaviors that allow you to be creative, be innovative, push the boundaries, and therefore result in high creative performance. Good. But it's important to also realize the dark side, and therefore, one way to do so is to have people with different levels of risk propensity, and by having people with different levels of risk propensity, you actually can capture this curve that are along the incongruous line. Alright, so important to recruit people with different levels of risk propensity to avoid workplace homogeneity. Otherwise, if you say you only want all high, you might end up with the diminishing return. Okay. And finally, okay, it's given that the leader is the one who is more impactful, okay, than the follower in the incongruence effect. It is critical to train leaders on the importance of evaluating and controlling the inherent risks in creativity. By doing so, the leaders know that, hey, high risk propensity is good for creativity, sure, but I also should value the points of views of followers who appear to be low on risk propensity. Instead of brushing them aside, those feedback and ideas are actually good. You keep the leader grounded in pursuing innovative ideas that are actually useful and worthwhile. All right. With that, I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, HP. I think one of the things that's particularly struck me that's interesting about that talk is this idea of balancing out, right? And so it would be easy to think of two people who are have a high degree of risk propensity making really risky decisions. but this was actually looking at creativity, which is a little bit different, right? So it's you might say, oh, two people who are, you get a group of people together and they're highly they tend to like risky decisions. They're going to make really risky decisions. But this is looking at it in the context of creativity, and it's actually, right, suggesting that you don't want both to be really high. And I think it might have to do, and we talked a little bit about this, HP and I previously, that creativity is hard work. We tend to think of creativity as something that just comes to you, but people who study it and people who really practice, people who are the most creative organizations, it's a practice and it's hard work. And if you just say, we're going to come up with these crazy ideas and do them, you need someone who kind of says, all right, let's check this idea. If you really want to be creative, it's not just going with your first wild idea. It's actually the tough work of creativity. So I'm wondering if, with limited data, we always have to think about what is the next question. Perhaps that could be at least one explanation. So thank you very much, HP, for that research. So our third presenter today is Dr. Terry Scandura, who is a professor of management at the University of Miami. She previously served as dean of the graduate school from 2007 to 2012 at the University of Miami, and is now back in her research and professor role, and I think much happier to be doing so. She has an extensive and really exemplary history of publishing in the topic of leadership. She is one of the beacons on the topic of how leaders and members, right? So sometimes we struggle with this. Do we call them leader follower? Well, that sounds derogatory. There's one of the approaches is leader member exchange. How that relationship looks, which forms to some extent the backbone of what we're talking about today. She's really been a beacon in that literature. And has also published extensively on the topic of research methods in the context of management. So she has authored or co-authored over 200 papers, presentations, articles, and book chapters. And she has a new book coming out, a new textbook called Essentials of Organizational Behavior, an Evidence-Based Approach, which will be published by Sage this summer, I think by this July. She will be talking today about forgotten diversity. So the idea of immigrant acculturation and how that affects leader-member relationships. Something that in the Miami community, when you think about people coming into our community and having to adapt to a new culture, and that being that the leader and member are of different cultures, how do they collectively create potentially a third culture, which she'll explain a little bit more about. Dr. Terry Scandura, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's delightful for me to come here to FIU, to the Center for Leadership, and hear about all the great things that they're doing. Okay. I'm going to talk about immigrant diversity and host country acculturation in leader-member dyads. You heard both Emily and HP refer to an approach to studying leadership called the leader-member exchange model of leadership, and I've been involved in that line of research for over 25 years. And I must credit my co-author, Monica Sharif, my PhD student, who's now at San Francisco State University, with this as well. So a little bit of background. This is one of the most important organizational considerations, this leader-member exchange or LMX relationship. And it's a dyadic two-way relationship between supervisors and direct reports. We've been studying this for over 40 years. I became involved. My major professor is George Grain, one of the founders of the LMX theory. And I jumped on board a little bit later, and I've been studying it for just over about 25 years now. LMX research appears to be in need of additional theory and empirical work. Criticism of that, including HP, I couldn't agree with him more. Specifically, there's a need for more research on the role of national culture in the development of leader-member exchange. This particular study will focus on the immigrant experience and how that may contribute to the development of leader-follower relationships. Three critical issues are the absence of substantial theoretical and empirical work on dissimilar LMX dyads, especially research on immigrants in organizations in general, and specifically in the leadership literature. There's an absence of research on the influence of immigrant acculturation on LMX specifically, and there's a general lack of research on cultural variables beyond the cultural values frameworks that we see that may influence leader-member relationships in the organization. The need for examination of cultural dissimilarity, I believe, is of critical importance to American success in the last century. There's been a tremendous influx of talented immigrants, and today global centers on competition for people rather than for goods or services. Just to give you some statistics, 700,000 plus new permanent legal U.S. residents each year for the last 10 years. Over 1 million for each of the last 7 years have entered our workforce. 400,000 plus individuals were granted immigrant visas over the last 5 years. Immigrants represent 47% of the growth in the U.S. labor force, so this is clearly an important topic. And it's a little bit embarrassing, honestly, that our literature and organizational behavior and leadership hasn't looked very much at this. And so one of the interesting things about being at my stage of my career is that, one of the things that students in the audience, other researchers, ask yourself, what is the literature not talking about? So at my stage, I can take risks and I can study things that other people don't study and kind of put it out there. And it's one of the things I enjoy most about being more senior in the field. So we really need to study this. Despite calls for research for over 30 years, there's a review of marginalized groups did not identify even one article that included immigrants, a recent article by Ruggs et al. 2013, published in the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology Perspectives. Due to the growth of the immigrant population and competition for immigrant employees, particularly in information technology and engineering, Bignelli emphasized the need for more research on immigration in the organizational context. Fitzsimmons recently, an AMR article, did discuss the increasing number of multiculturals in the workplace and the contributions of these individuals to organizations. So there has been some theoretical work. So to define an immigrant, very simply, it's a person who comes to live permanently in a foreign country. A resident of a country who were born abroad, do not possess local citizenship, and yet live there permanently. And so what we want to study is the relationship of the immigrant host country acculturation process on the leader-member exchange, or the relationship that develops between leaders and followers, and how that in turn may impact performance, organizational citizenship behavior known as OCBs, job satisfaction, and the intention to quit the organization. We also thought that there may be some variables that affect this relationship. One being diversity climate, how supportive the organization is of diversity, that seems to make sense, and the cultural intelligence of the supervisor. So acculturation is when groups of individuals having different cultures come together. They have first-hand contact, and then the subsequent changes of the original culture patterns on either or both groups. Acculturation can occur in many forms. It can be reactive and elicit resistance to the change in both parties, both leader and follower. It can be creative, prompting new cultural forms that were not originally part of either party's culture. It can be delayed and not apparent until years in the future. Someone doesn't have the insight about acculturation until years later. Why is all this important? I wanted to talk to this audience about this. I don't think I even need to have this slide, okay, because we're all, involved in immigrant. My father was an immigrant. Monica Sharif's father was an immigrant, so this was a topic that was very close to us. And we saw the struggles that our parents went through, and we really wanted to study this. A few reasons. Individuals from different cultures may construe events in disparate ways, and that can impact the leader-member relationship. Leaders and members may have unique perceptions regarding what constitutes effective leadership. These implicit leadership theories may vary by culture. Leaders and members may develop a third culture by combining both individuals' cultural backgrounds, the creative component, and there's a great article by Kashmir, a classic article. George Grain, my advisor, picked up on this and has written about it. And I have a picture to show you about what we're really talking about when we talk about building the third culture. that two parties come together, a person from culture A and a person from culture B, and they begin to interact with one another through their contact. And if they need each other, if they need the relationship, the process may continue or the process may end at that point. But if there's a continued need to interact, I need my boss needs me, then the interaction and the process of building or organizing may begin, or the process may fail at that point. And then it may go to the third level, which we call the third culture building commences, or the process can fail at that point. So you can see, I believe that these relationships, where one party is an immigrant, are really at risk for failure, much more so than two people from the same culture. But when it's successful, a third culture emerges within the dyad, within the two-party relationship. That's not culture A or not culture B, but people begin to interact in a way that's an amalgamation, you're nodding, of both cultures, where we begin to understand each other. And it has elements of both cultures. And that's what's called the third culture. Acculturation strategies, according to Barry, a classic approach to this. Marginalization, people have no interest in preserving their own culture, and they have no interest in interacting with the larger society. They isolate themselves. Separation, prioritizing the value of your own culture and simultaneously avoiding contact with other cultures. Some people take that approach. Assimilation, pursue daily interaction with differing cultures, but they don't preserve their own cultural identity. An example of his assimilation is my own father. His name's Alfio Giuseppe, but when he was an Italian immigrant, he was in the Boston area, he Americanized his name, okay, and took on the name Alfred Joseph. So he legally changed his name, and that's a good example of where someone's assimilating to fit into the culture they're in. Integration, then, is when people preserve their own cultural values while making continuous efforts to interact with other cultural groups, okay? And so that's when we do both, okay? We preserve our own culture, but we also, work with the other culture. So obviously, we're very interested in integration. We're very interested in this immigrant host country acculturation process, and then how that may impact the emergence of high-quality relationships between leaders and followers. So we think that host country acculturation will be positively related to the leader-member exchange relationship. Second, we think that the leader-member exchange relationship actually plays a mediating role or a pivotal role, if you will. That if we have high-quality relationships, then it strengthens the relationship between acculturation and these outcomes. And these are outcomes that we're interested in organizations. We're interested in performance. We're interested in organizational citizenship. We're interested in job satisfaction and turnover. Here are the moderators. We think that having a positive climate for diversity in the organization will strengthen that relationship between acculturation and LMX. The diversity climate is an individual's perception of the degree to which a firm is thought to utilize fair employee policies, socially integrate underrepresented employees into the work setting. We also think that perhaps supervisor cultural intelligence positively moderates the relationship between host country acculturation and leader-member exchange. Cultural intelligence is an individual's capability to function and manage effectively in culturally diverse settings. So to summarize, host country acculturation is positively related to LMX. This is just what I just told you, but this is a summary of the hypotheses. A note on cultural intelligence, for those of you that may not be familiar with that concept, it's made up of different elements: the metacognitive, the planning, the cognitive, which is procedural, pattern recognition, scanning, and self-awareness, the motivational, which is efficacy, persistence, really trying to work to understand other cultures, and then finally behavioral. It's what we do, our repertoire, our practices, our rituals, and our newly learned behaviors. We collected data from 2 different organizations, and we ended up with 190 matched leader-member dyads. As HP mentioned, it's really good to have data from multiple sources, so we have that. So we ended up with 116 cross-cultural dyads, 74 non-immigrant dyads. For this study, we used the cross-cultural dyads clearly. You can see the gender representation, which was fairly balanced, as well as the supervisor gender representation, and as well as the age distributions. From the subordinates, we asked them their demographics. That's important. Were you born in the U.S.? When did they move to the U.S. to get a sense to classify them as an immigrant status, and their country of origin? We measured acculturation using a published measure. These are example items. I often participate in mainstream American cultural traditions. Diversity climate, we used a published measure. My company maintains a diversity-friendly work environment is an example item from that measure. And then cultural intelligence. We had organizations screaming that our survey was too long. This is common. And so we only measured 2 dimensions of cultural intelligence. The metacognitive, I am conscious of the cultural knowledge I use when interacting with people with different cultural backgrounds, and the motivational. I enjoy interacting with people from different cultures. Previous research on cultural intelligence does show that these 4 dimensions are really highly related to one another, so we felt somewhat safe, selecting 2 measures and going with those, in the interest of keeping the survey reasonable in length. We measured LMX using the standard LMX measure. How well does your leader understand your job problems and needs, as an example. Job satisfaction, we used the Hackman and Oldham 3-item measure. Generally speaking, I'm satisfied with my job, very satisfied with my job. Turnover intentions, we measured it with items like, at this time, if it were possible, I would quit my job. From the supervisors, we asked them the same demographics to classify them as immigrant or non-immigrant. We had the supervisors rate the performance of followers using an established measure. For example, always completes duties and assignments assigned to him or her. We also looked at organizational citizenship behavior, or OCBs, using the Lee and Allen measure. Do you willingly give your time to help others? It's extra role performance, helping others who have work-related problems. So we first did a confirmatory factor analysis to see if all these measures were different from one another. That's very important. And then we tested the hypothesis using mediation methods, the process regression with bootstrapping. So you can see this is the correlation matrix. You can see, I'll move on from this very quickly, but you can see along the diagonal that all of the reliabilities are estimates. It's a measure of how good our measures are or how repeatable our measures are. We're all in the acceptable range. The confirmatory factor analysis showed that we're reasonably certain that these measures are distinct from one another, with the 8-factor model having the best model fit. And this is a lot of numbers in the moderated mediation, so I'll just, if you would like a copy of the paper, I'd love to send you one. Just email me, scandura@miami.edu. But what we found is that there was a diversity climate did significantly moderate this relationship, and we're really excited about that finding. In that when we have a high diversity climate in the organization, you can see, okay, that basically the high diversity climate, really think of it as it kind of protects or it's like an inoculation, okay, if you will, that leader-member exchange is higher, regardless of whether or not there's low host country acculturation or high host country acculturation. Okay, so I think that's a really important finding. The climate of the organization for diversity really makes a difference in supporting the emergence of high-quality leader-follower relationships, even when the person is not assimilating. The results for cultural intelligence didn't come out. Okay, so I know the cultural intelligence people don't like this very well, okay, but we did not find that supervisor cultural intelligence made a difference. We also had follower cultural intelligence, but that didn't make a difference either. So basically you can see the hypothesis. Host country acculturation was positively related to LMX. All of the hypotheses, okay, for the mediation effect were significant. So leader-member exchange does mediate the relationship. It has a pivotal role in translating that acculturation experience into outcomes of performance and turnover intentions. Diversity climate positively did moderate the relationship. I just showed you that graph. But supervisor and cultural intelligence did not. So the implications for theory, I'm going to come back to this. Immigrants are increasingly present in organizations. It's time for management and scholars, and not just leadership scholars, but management scholars, whatever they study, to study the immigrant experience. We introduced a model examining differences in culturally dissimilar immigrant, non-immigrant versus culturally similar leader-member dyads with respect to LMX. Future research can build on this conceptualization and investigation of immigrant identity by bringing in other culturally diverse leader-member relationships, such as mentoring, teams, networks. The implications for practice. I know I want to get right to the practical implications of this. Diversity due to immigration is increasing. This research does take the first step in understanding how immigration may affect interpersonal relationships at the workplace. The results suggest that organizational decision makers may need to consider acculturation, cultural intelligence, possibly, but certainly the diversity climate and their relationships to leader-member relationships. The research provides insights into how immigrants may adjust to their leaders and the organizations when they are culturally incongruent with their supervisor. Findings show diversity climate matters, so do company-wide policies, which are the procedures and norms, and that should be enhanced. There are some implications for diversity training, I think. Cultural intelligence may not matter, but the acceptance of cultural differences and highlighting the advantages is important. Acculturation strategy is important for the development of relationships. The involvement of both supervisors and subordinates in one-on-one discussions should be part of diversity training. Findings demonstrate that cultural differences in LMX may increase performance and job satisfaction. They may reduce turnover. For future research, we can have more theory development on how immigrants navigate through the entry to the organization, interacting with supervisors, management, coworkers, or teams. Immigrant, non-immigrant dyads, establishment of LMX congruence. Those pretty pictures that HP just showed you. We have leader-follower data, and we are going to look at agreement with this data set and the kinds of congruence that he was looking at, because we can do that with the data that we have. Examination of the impact of different types of ethnic identities. One of the things we weren't able to look at with our sample size, does it matter, if it's, a Hispanic person, a Chinese person, that's really an open area for research, and I think a lot can be done there. Multicultural ethnic identity may influence LMX congruence as well. Again, we should look at immigrant status and work relationships related to building the third culture, more in-depth study of how that third culture gets built, maybe through qualitative interview studies would be, I think, very beneficial. Rich descriptive data would be useful. Experimental studies. We can look at experiments that look at decision-making processes of multiculturals. And we could perhaps look at leadership potential in different experimental contexts, different experimental conditions. Again, I call for more field research looking at immigrants in several different organizations in different cities, both in the U.S. and worldwide. Immigration is not a phenomenon that's only happening in the U.S. This is happening everywhere. So this can be studied in other cultures as well. And finally, looking at additional cultural mediating and moderating variables. One of the things we do have in this data set is societal tightness and looseness. Hofstede's cultural values could also, we don't have that in this data set, but we used cultural tightness, looseness as a measure, but additional cultural variables can be brought in and looked at how, as moderators, to see how that impacts the relationship. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions ahead.
Thank you, Terry. It's interesting to me, this finding has come up again and again, that if you want to predict how well someone is going to perform in their job, a huge predictor of that is the quality of relationship that they have with their boss. Now, that doesn't mean being friends with your boss, but it means having a high-quality working relationship that's built on trust and on an understanding of them having your back, you have theirs, that takes time to develop, right? And so when you have someone, one of the big predictors of whether or not you have a good relationship with your boss is how similar you are to your boss. Now, that can have all kinds of implications, right, in a diversity context, because the boss who is more likely to lead and set the tone of that relationship, sometimes it can be up on the follower a little bit, but the boss is the one leading that relationship, and it's on them to do that. They're more likely to cultivate an effective working relationship with people who they perceive as similar to themselves. That has all kinds of problems, right? And so if you layer this on someone who is more likely to be different, you bring someone in from another country, they're even, again, more likely to be different. Even if they're maybe of the same cultural origin originally, a new immigrant is less familiar, and it's less likely then to have an effective working relationship with their boss, right? Unless, right, and I think there's something really interesting here, unless the diversity culture of the organization is strong. Right? So organizations, people talk about whether or not, does culture of an organization matter? And absolutely it matters. It matters in all kinds of ways. And culture isn't just one thing, right? We can think of it along all kinds of different dimensions. This is saying, look, if the culture for diversity is strong and effective, it's going to make it easier for that new immigrant to have an effective working relationship with their boss, and in turn, for them to be more effective helping out the organization, to be performing better. They're more likely to stay. A whole host of things come in after that. So if there's anything that we can do to increase the effectiveness of that leader-member relationship, we're all for it. Now, so my boss thinks things are great, ... And there are all kinds of things that predict whether or not that relationship is going to be effective. And really the one sort of meta take-home for this is that, to a large extent, it is up to the boss to set the tone of that relationship and have their ear to the ground as to what's actually happening, and not be deluded by thinking that the relationship is going fine. Because many times you ask a boss, how effective is your relationship with, let's say, this given subordinate or follower, right? And they'll say it's great. Then you ask the follower, and they give you a different story, right? And that incongruence can actually turn out to be quite meaningful. Right? And so how do you make sure, as a boss, we're talking of this it could be any type of leader, it doesn't have to be in a formal appointed situation, be consistent. And do you have your ear to the ground of what's actually happening? And are you effectively fostering the relationship of people who are different from you? And this matters if we're going to get the best out of the human capital that we have in organizations, we need to be thinking about these things. So thank you to all three of you for his wonderful presentation.
This has been a production of Academic Video Services within the Division of Information Technology at Florida International University.